Great. Thanks all for coming. Quick introduction. My name's Tom Burnell. As Travis was saying, I work for Axway. Axway was traditionally a company with a background in managed file transfer and business-to-business technologies through EDI-type integrations. In December 2012, they acquired a company called Vordel, which is where I come from, and Vordel has been making SOA and API management solutions for over 10 years now. I've allowed some time at the end for questions, but do feel free to interrupt me sort of halfway through if something's not making sense. And likewise, I know that I tend to speak very quickly. So if that becomes a problem again, please do let me know and I'll slow things down. Excellent. So we're here to talk about different types of APIs, public, private, and partner, which actually becomes a tongue twister when you keep saying it repeatedly throughout the course of a week, I can assure you. But we're going to talk about what we actually mean by these different types of APIs, what directions people are going in with them generally, and look at some use cases of the different types, and then finally discuss some best practices, whether your API is always going to be private or whether you're building it from the ground up to be public. Now, I'm going to break with tradition at these events and not show either a programmable web chart or one with an iceberg. But as Andreas was saying, there's no real way of knowing how many, what the number of private and partner to public APIs is, but I've seen estimates of sort of 3 and 4 to 1. And this chart is a little bit out of date now, but if we look at the top two examples there, those are both, application integration, that's an internal, that's a private API, and the second one, collaboration with partners. And we can see that those are outstripping the rest of them by a long way. People are not just using them to, sign into Facebook. And that ties into my experience too. The vast majority of Axway's customers are using their APIs either purely internally to enable, single sign-on to applications for staff, for example, or to integrate with partners. But there are exceptions, and we're seeing a growing trend of applications that or APIs that started off internally being exposed out to partners, and then from there to third-party developers in the wider world. And this brings a different set of challenges, but also benefits. And we're going to talk about those as well as look at some examples. There's a lot of different ways to define private and public APIs, and I think Andreas did a very good example of it there. But is an API that's accessible from anywhere, but not documented or officially supported, is that a private or a public API? Now, I would say it's supposed to be a private API, and I'd also say it was a very bad idea. And I'm not sure if these guys would agree. Now, for those that don't know, this is Tesla Motors, and I think this isn't the first time they're going to come up today, actually. But they build very cool electric cars, as I'm sure some of you know, and they also built in an API to access various functions of their cars. But what they then did was a bit odd. They came up with this authentication method that was a little bit like OAuth, but they didn't actually use OAuth. And as a result, they built this method whereby an access token, which allows you to perform functions on your car via a smartphone, it lasts for 3 months, and there's no way to revoke it. So if this gets compromised, 3 months is a very long time to be driving around in a car that someone else can unlock the doors or open the windows to when you're driving at 100 kilometers an hour. To go back to Andreas' example of the house there, what they've done really is build a really cool house, and they've stuffed it with really cool stuff, but they've put a really bad lock on the door because they've stuck it in the middle of the forest and hoped that no one found it. That's not a great idea. But there are other reasons why having an undocumented but accessible API in the wild is a bad idea. Primarily, developers are going to find it, and if it's doing cool stuff, they are going to use it. Instagram's first API was an example of this. It got reverse engineered back in 2010, well before they officially published their API. And when developers start using your API, you've got a problem. You're stuck between a rock and a hard place, really, because you've got two choices. Either what you take it officially public with the versioning, the security challenges, and the sort of stuff that brings, or you yank it completely. You go more private, as Andreas was just saying. And the problem there is that you're going to annoy the developers, and also you're going to annoy the end users. Now, you could legitimately say, well, so what? If a developer is using an undocumented API, it's their problem when it disappears. But as far as that end user is concerned, they don't know that their app is using the Instagram's undocumented API. All they know is Instagram has just stopped working, and that's a problem. So, I'm going to define private APIs as ones that are only used internally or by your own employees, and public APIs as ones that can be used by anyone. possibly, probably having to register, developers having to register for them first. But as we were saying, there's a third group, and probably the most commonly seen in Axway, which are partner APIs, where you expose them out to a group of trusted business partners for business-to-business interactions. So you could also call them B2B APIs, and I see that term coming up quite a lot as well. And as I said, most of our customers started off with internal APIs, possibly as a result of earlier SOA-based practices. But even if you're developing APIs with the intention of even if you're developing APIs with the intention of exposing them publicly, there are benefits to using them internally as well, and as again, Andreas was just saying this. First of all, your developers are going to spot issues with your APIs faster than external developers are. And secondly, it just makes architectural good sense if you've just got a single route into the back-end systems via the APIs, whether they're coming externally or from your own internal web apps. I've talked about this sort of subject before, and Amazon's edict that everything must be a service is still probably the best example I know of this. But what I'd like to do is look at an example of one of our customers that's doing this. Essent are a power company based in the Netherlands. They're part of the RWE group, and they've got a very strong focus on renewable energy. They've got a SOA-based architecture they've leveraged out, and they started off with just applications for their employees, but they moved from there to their partners, and then from there to their customers, and then from there, they now expose public APIs that anyone can use. So what are they doing with it? They're doing lots and lots of different things, but one example is what they call the mobile smart grid. And this is the complete system of interactions between, for example, electric cars, power distribution points and power generation points, whether they're local or centralized. And so, for example, an electric car driver can use the mobile smart grid to find out where the nearest available car charging point is, whereas Essent can use it themselves to balance supply and demand for electricity, as well as demonstrate in real time what sort of percentage is coming from renewable energy. And as I said, that's something that's very important to them to keep their green credentials. They're also exposing the APIs to partners. But let's look at an example where partners are the main focus of the API. So Hutchison 3G, better known as 3, are a large mobile telecoms provider operating in Denmark, Sweden, the UK and Ireland and several other countries. As the name suggests, certainly in the UK, and I now know Sweden, they were the first providers of 3G telephone networks. Can someone confirm that in Denmark? Yep, great. If nothing else, it tells me people are still awake. So, their partners in this first use case are MVNOs, mobile virtual network operators, and these are guys that they supply mobile services to customers, but they don't own their own infrastructure, so they lease it off people that do, such as 3. So they need then to access 3's systems for things like subscriber provisioning, billing information. Obviously, that all then needs to be authenticated and authorized. Another example of their partner strategy is they allow their customers to top up their pay-as-you-go credit via ATMs or bankomats. And in this case, the partners are the ATM operators or the banks themselves. This is a great example of dog fooding. As we were saying, using your own APIs. They have a web shop whereby their customers can top up their credit directly on their web shop. And again, that is all going through the same APIs. And finally, they were using it they were seeing spikes in requests for certain APIs. So they wanted a platform that would allow them to rate limit these requests. And we're going to talk about rate limiting a bit more later on. Dancing Pony. Did you guys get this advert? Because they didn't in Sweden. No, it played just before Christmas. It was a Shetland pony moonwalking backwards across a pretty country landscape to the background of 80s music. It had absolutely nothing to do with telecoms at all, which is probably why everyone liked it. Anyway, look it up. Store brand, another use case, and a good example of using APIs to integrate with partners. So they were leading in the Nordic market for long-term savings and insurance. I swore I wasn't going to read the slides, but they acquired a Swedish company in 2008, and they realized their current strategy wasn't enough in terms of integrating with partners. Their existing integrations were built on several different back-end systems that didn't provide the required security. So they decided to build a partner API strategy. And they started off with the Norwegian Labour and Welfare Administration, but today they've got over 20 different partners integrated through their APIs. From there, and again, we're talking about this moving out to exposing things at least to the consumer, if not to third-party developers. They've implemented an SSO strategy for their customers. So if you're logged onto StoreBrand's website and you've got an account with them that allows trading, it will log you on seamlessly onto the NASDAQ in the US and allow you to make trades with them. So that's not necessarily the benefit of APIs directly, but the benefit of using an API management type platform. It lets you do this sort of thing. And as with S3, as I was saying, growing trend, they're also exposing out mobile apps for their healthcare customers. And as we can see here, to exposing APIs to price comparison websites. And I want to briefly digress and talk about this, because I was in Sweden earlier this year, I think it was January or February, and I was having a conversation with a guy at a large Swedish insurance company. And what he said surprised me. We were pitching the API gateway to him, and I don't think it was really resonating, so I tried to get an idea of really why we were there. What was his interest in an API strategy? And he said that he wanted to better expose his back-end systems to his broker network. You know, the guys on the high street, they have a little shop, you walk in, you give them your details, they type stuff in, and they get you your car insurance quote. They still exist. And I said, yeah, absolutely, we can do that, no problem, we can help you with that. And then I pointed to the StoreBrand case study and said, hey, look, these guys are doing that sort of thing as well, but they're also using it to expose it out to, you know, a price comparison type website. In this case, this is provided by the Norwegian Consumer Council. And I said that in the UK, more than 50% of car and home insurance purchases were made via price comparison websites that are all using APIs into each of the individual insurance companies. But what he said next was really surprising. He said, we don't want to do that. I said, well, why not? He said, we want our customers or prospects to come directly to us, either on the phone or sit down with a broker so we can give them the best customer experience. Now, I'm never going to criticize a customer for wanting to provide good customer experience. This week, I'm going to be eating at a lot of restaurants and staying in a lot of hotels, and I like good customer service, as I'm sure do all of you. But I view car insurance as a necessary evil. You've got to have it. It costs you money, so you want it as cheaply and as conveniently as possible. Yes? No? Yeah. Great. So again, I mean, I should also point out that there are 2 insurers in the UK that don't participate famously in price comparison websites, but it seemed like a very odd attitude to me, possibly just maybe a cultural thing, or maybe it's just that, you know, I'm obviously big into sort of web integration and APIs and this sort of stuff. Anyway, moving on. The last thing they're doing with this, and this is more about consuming APIs than exposing them really, but they're integrating with the Bank ID service, which allows you to digitally sign documents and statements and have them be legally binding. I put up this slide yesterday and someone pointed out that I was using the Swedish Bank ID logo rather than the Norwegian one, but I've now corrected it. So I think this is a brilliant idea. We don't really have any concept of it in the UK. I know it's spreading more in the Nordics. We're getting asked about it a lot in Sweden. I was talking yesterday about how I had to remortgage my flat recently, and they said, okay, if you can just sign this document and fax it over. I'm like, fax? Right. That's that dusty thing in the corner, isn't it? I said, look, I don't actually have a fax machine. I said, look, can I scan it and send it to you via email? He said, it's not the same thing. And I said, it's exactly the same thing. But you're never going to win that argument. So I did. I went on Google and I found out my local library had a fax machine, and I went in and I put in my 2 £1 coins because it was so old it didn't accept a £2 coin, and then I had the librarian show me how to use it. So this is a really good idea, basically. Anyway, so the StoreBrand case study as a whole and the trend towards opening up is a great example of one of the recommendations that I want to make to you today. When designing APIs, even if you think they're only ever going to be used privately, think about the implications in terms of security and in interoperability of making them public. Because with very few exceptions, at some point, someone in your organization is going to say, hey, I've worked out a way we can make money by opening this API up. And at that point, it's your job to do it. And it's going to be so much easier if you've thought about that from the get-go, from the very start. I'm not going to go into details on good API design now. There are far better experts around to talk about this, and you're going to hear about some of it this afternoon. But I'm talking about basic security stuff. Like, don't, for example, ignore transport level security because it's only ever going to be accessed via a VPN or within your firewall. Where are we? Don't neglect authentication and authorization, thinking that anyone that can get to it is allowed to use it, because that's not always going to be the case. And don't, think about not sanity checking your inputs, because, why would anyone want to try and break my API? It's basic security stuff, and it can be tempting to ignore it if you're building a private API just for the sake of convenience. But as I say, if and when the time comes to open it up, it's going to be a lot easier if you've done it right in the first place. So we've talked about purely internal APIs, and we've talked about partner APIs, and we've talked about certainly the more common mix that we're seeing of both. But let's look at one case study where they are purely using, genuinely exposing them out to third-party developers. CVS Caremark are a healthcare provider and pharmacy chain in the US. They have 7,000 stores. They are the 40th largest company in the world. They are the 13th largest company in America, and they're the largest company in America that only operates in America. And that pretty much brings me to the end of what I know about them as a company, except they charge a hell of a lot for aspirin. Anyway, they've got an API strategy, and it's all publicly exposed. You can do things like check your prescription status, check the refill times when you can get it refilled, where you can pick up your refills from, and you can actually order the refills via APIs. And all of these APIs are exposed out via a developer portal shown here. So one of the things that you can do with it, and it's quite neat, you can send in a barcode, and that then gets linked to a particular prescription. So, for example, they provided a sample application, including the source code for developers, whereby on your mobile phone, you pick up your bottle of medicine, you scan the barcode using your phone, you then select which pharmacy you want to collect it from, and you've placed your order. Really making things easier for their end users. Now, they wanted to know exactly who's using their API, understandably. So you can register for a key. Any of you guys can go on there and register for a key today. Even if it's for non-commercial use, though, you still do need to register. And again, that's the sort of thing that we're seeing in the certainly in the enterprise API market. There are very few free-for-alls where you can just start using an API without any need for registration. And there were good reasons for that, as we're going to come on to later. So, some of the case studies, and I would like to talk about some recommendations. And a quick swig of water first. I did a Google for looking towards the future on an image search, and this is what it came up with. I have absolutely no idea what it is. I just think it's a really cool picture. Anyway, as I've said several times so far, there's value to be had in designing your private APIs with an eye on making them public, and also in using your public APIs internally. The actual features and functionality of your API are going to differ depending on who the intended target is. For example, if you're designing a public API from the start, you're going to want to make it really easy to use. Whereas if you're designing it for a partner integration, you're probably going to want to make things a little bit stricter in terms of inputs, in terms of required fields, just so you can make this rock-solid business integration. However, also the protocols are probably going to be different as well. Certainly what we see, partner APIs, private APIs at the moment are still very much SOAP-based. Whereas we all know that in the public API world, the open APIs, they tend to be REST-based. Again, this is a subject I've talked about before, and I'm not going to get into it now. But there are some key factors that are the same, regardless of whether or not regardless of who you're designing your API for. So security, this is absolutely the most important one as far as I'm concerned. I think it's a subject that's going to come up a number of times today. So we've already seen releasing an unsecured or a badly secured API out into the wild and simply hoping no one else is going to find it is not an option. It could get hacked, obviously. Or you'll have to yank it, as we said, and that's going to annoy the developers, and more, you're going to lose your reputation with your end users. So security through obscurity here is simply not an option. There are many ways you can secure access to your APIs, and the guys from Ping and so forth, they're going to give you, talk about that in more detail. So they're going to talk about, OAuth, OpenID, that sort of stuff. One of the things that we see quite a lot with partner APIs is using two-way SSL using client certificates, and that gives you a very strong authentication and security method. And there are API management platforms that can help you with all of these different types of methods if you don't want to roll your own like Tesla did. And I'd suggest you also might want to enforce registration for developers, even for your internal APIs. Purely, possibly, because there might be someone in your organization doing something really cool with your API and you'd like to know about it. So protecting your APIs with these authentication and authorization requirements, it also protects you from the it's all inside the firewall fallacy that I mentioned earlier. But you're still going to need to sanitize your inputs, check for injection attacks, that sort of stuff. And again, this is the sort of thing an API management platform can help you with. So moving on. Throttling. Rate limiting. Another best practice, regardless of whether we're talking public, private, or partner, is to rate limit access to your services, or at least build in the ability to do so. And the reasons for this differ depending on who you're exposing these APIs to. Even for internal APIs, there's a possibility that some rookie developer starts writing an app against the API and gets something wrong, fires it off, sends off 100,000 requests in a second, and takes down your back-end systems. When we're talking about partner APIs, you're going to have a reasonable idea of how much load each one of those partners is going to need to consume, so you can allocate them that load while still protecting the rest of the bandwidth for your other partners. And that's key, for example, for your reputation, if it's allowing partners to place orders with you. Walmart are famous for placing an order with a company, and if a receipt of the order is not received within a certain amount of time, they assume that the order has been refused and they'll go elsewhere. And obviously for public APIs, we've got not just the use case where a developer gets things wrong, but you've actually got malicious developers or malicious hackers out there that might try and take down your service using a denial of service attack. And I have no idea why that happened. Okay. Yep. Ah. Ah. Excellent. So you don't need to necessarily refuse service if someone breaches the allocated, if a developer breaches their allocation or a partner breaches their allocation. You might simply want to alert someone to this fact. So for example, if a partner exceeds their allocated amount of transactions, you might want to alert the sales team so they can go to the partner and say, oh, do you want us to up your SLAs? And by the way, that's going to be another $10,000. All of these sort of SLAs, these can be built again into a developer-type portal within an API management platform. Key part of all of this, I think I've worked out what I'm doing, is my paper keeps rubbing on this. Sorry about that. Key part of all of this is analytics. It's really important to know who's using your APIs, what they're using them for, and when they're using them. With partners, identifying which partners are using your service the most could be very important. It may be that they're customers of yours and you want to charge them accordingly, as I mentioned earlier. Or it may be that you're customers of theirs and you want to recognize the business value between them. Now, for public APIs, any monetization strategy depends on analytics. It might be lots of different strategies. There might be developer pays, for example. There might be end user pays, or there might be indirect revenue via advertising streams. But all of these require knowing who is using those APIs and how much use they're getting out of them. And then internally, it's a different set of motivations. There's unlikely to be any direct revenue streams associated with an internal API, but you still need to demonstrate the value of that API to the business. Whether it's through increased code reuse, whether it's through interoperability, more interactions. And the best way to do this is to know who is using your APIs and what they're using them for. Right, so you might have the best API in the world. It might be fully featured, it might be easy to use, it might be secured, you might have your SLAs and your monitoring and your analytics in place, but if you adopt the field of dreams approach, there's no guarantee that it's going to work. And by the field of dreams approach, I mean if you build it, they will come. You need to drive developer adoption. So how do we do this? Well, if you ask developers what they want in terms of an API, the absolute key, 11 out of 10 on the priority scale, is going to be documentation. But what this doesn't mean is providing reams and reams of documentation that they have to read through and digest to get started with your APIs. By all means, document every method, every call, every function, every object in great detail. But do that in addition to giving them what they need to really get started. And what do they really need to get started? They need a simple description of its API and its methods, the endpoints that it's exposed on. They need to know at a glance which parameters are mandatory and which ones are optional. They need to know what security settings they're expected to implement. And they need to know where they can get a token or a key if they need one. Ideally, they also want sample requests and responses so they can get started straight away. You may even want to include code snippets, but Holger's going to talk about that a bit more in detail, so I'm going to leave that one. Now, stability of APIs is also an important consideration. Open APIs constantly evolve, as we know, and there's a lot of discussion in this area as to how best to manage that evolution. How long should you support a given version of an API for? How should you tell your developers that you're about to retire an API? Even stuff like, should the version parameter be in the path, or should it be one of the parameters that's passed through? But this becomes even more important when we're talking about B2B, partner, or internal APIs. Consumer applications constantly evolve and can take account of changes to the structure of APIs. But when you're building a business-to-business interaction, you're expecting a solid interaction that will last years, maybe even a decade or more without modification. So again, it's, ideally get it right in the first place, but have something in place to make sure that you can support legacy versions. And stability and versioning bring me to another consideration, how you stage your APIs. How you move both new APIs, new versions, and even new developers and users from a sandbox to a production environment. You're almost certainly going to want a sandbox environment, so you can test your own code, so you can test your APIs, develop new functionality. And unless you're just serving out information, unless it's a read-only API, you're almost certainly going to want to give developers access to a sandbox before letting them run wild against your live APIs and messing everything up. But what this means is that you need a way of seamlessly moving APIs, versions, developers from your sandbox environment to the production environment. And again, API management is working in this sort of area. So I'm going to sum up now. We've seen that although private and partner APIs massively outnumber public APIs, there is this growing trend towards opening up. And we've seen that even if you're designing a private API, it makes sense to learn lessons from the open API world. And likewise, if you're developing a public API, it makes sense to use it internally. We've seen that we've looked at examples of these practices and use cases across several different industries. And then we've looked at how to encourage developers to use your APIs through a user-friendly portal, for example, and good but not necessarily overwhelming documentation. The importance of giving them a sandbox environment to try new things and make mistakes in. And the importance of stability, or at least good versioning in your APIs, whether they're being used for public applications or longer-term business-to-business integrations. Talked about the importance of good SLAs and good monitoring and analytical information for developing and driving value from your APIs. And as I've mentioned several times, an API management platform can help you in all of these areas, and it's not going to surprise you to know that we actually sell just such a platform. But so do several other vendors. Anyway, if you'd like to know more about it, then please do come and talk to me or one of my colleagues from Axway. But in the meantime, thank you very much for listening, and I'd like to open it up to any questions.